Let's start with a brutal, undeniable metric. Current estimates place total Russian casualties since 2022 at roughly 1.2 million, operating at a steady attrition rate of around 26,000 losses per month. Behind the front lines, the domestic substrate is similarly depleted. The state is currently navigating a first-quarter budget deficit of 4.58 trillion rubles, alongside an immediate, acute shortage of at least 2.3 million workers. Yet, look at the streets of Moscow or St. Petersburg. The state openly counters these deficits, aggressively recruiting with sign-on bonuses reaching 695,000 rubles. The system functions. It recruits, it represses, and it remains occupied. This creates a severe analytical problem. Observers consistently scan for the moment public grievance boils over, assuming that high casualties and severe economic strain must inevitably trigger an uprising. Conventional metrics like polling and protest turnout fail to capture the state's true condition. In this model, we treat the regime as a multi-layered accumulation object. To understand when a system like this actually breaks, we have to look past the visible layer of public compliance. We have to map the hidden structural surfaces holding the regime together. In this framework, what we see on the news is merely the occupancy surface. This is the visible skin of the regime, the turnout at elections, the daily compliance of citizens, the bodies reporting to work. Below that is a far more critical boundary, the maintenance surface. This measures the capacity of the state to replenish its human and material substrate. It tracks the system's ability to pay, repair, and reproduce itself over time. Here is the structural danger inherent to autocracies. A regime can maintain high occupancy, an intact outer shell, while its maintenance surface collapses completely from within. Finally, there is the latent failure surface. This is the hidden boundary where the local pressure acting on an individual node finally exceeds the structural forces keeping them locked in place. We can calculate these boundaries. By applying the Gibsonian failure functional, we can measure exactly why the public has not moved, and by mapping the maintenance equation, we can project exactly how long the state can survive its current drain. High visible occupancy coupled with negative maintenance is not stability. It is a state of theatrical stability, the necessary mathematical precursor to a structural fracture. Let's evaluate the public first. We measure an individual citizen's stability using the local failure functional, written as y sub I equals U minus L. U represents the destabilizing load on the node, and L represents the stabilizing lock. When we input the current state of a representative Russian public node, the load is immense. Grievance, economic pressure, and meaning violation yield a high destabilizing score of 0.54. But the stabilizing lock is heavier. The state imposes severe retaliation exposure and intense exit friction, bringing the total lock value to 0.675. Subtracting lock from load gives us a negative value, negative 0.135. Because the failure signal is negative, the node cannot redistribute its behavior. It is mathematically jammed. This lock is the physical reality of the urban environment. The pervasive presence of internal security forces, tight control over digital networks, and closed borders maintain a rigid barrier to action. The public does not protest. They remain compliant strictly because the coercive lock applied to them heavily exceeds their current destabilizing load. Shift from the node to the system. We visualize the state's survival as a maintenance reservoir tank, initialized at a starting baseline of 1.0. Right now, the state's primary buffer is a massive commodity cushion. Driven by global energy shocks, recent models project an extraction tax windfall of roughly $9 billion in a single month. However, that inflow is fighting overwhelming structural drag. The system is actively bleeding capital to sustain the war effort, while simultaneously trying to manage extreme labor scarcity and severe infrastructure bottlenecks. When we run the values through the equation, even assigning a high 0.80 score to the oil cushion, the combined weight of the drains leads to a negative drift of negative 0.064 per quarter. This is a maintenance negative state. Despite the temporary oil revenue, the Russian system is structurally consuming its own physical and human substrate faster than it can replace it. If the extraordinary oil windfall decays from its current peak to a more standard level of 0.20, the drift accelerates to roughly 0.15 normalized units per quarter. At that rate, the remaining reservoir is consumed in just under 8 quarters, placing the structural exhaustion window in late 2027. Energy windfalls can extend the timeline of theatrical stability. They cannot reverse the mathematical decay of a structure under this degree of physical strain. Systemic exhaustion changes the internal hierarchy. The nodes holding the public in place, the enforcers, fiscal administrators, and regional elites, are anchored primarily by net material benefit, not by fear. As the maintenance reservoir drains toward zero, the regime loses the capital required to pay its recruiters and secure its elites. The lock keeping these critical nodes compliant rapidly deteriorates. When we model a prolonged decline in resources, the calculation shifts. The failure signal for a representative elite node flips from a stable minus 0.28, crossing the threshold, to a positive 0.06. A rigid autocracy fractures exactly at this moment. It breaks when the enforcer subgraph loses its own lock and drops its capacity to maintain pressure on the broader pile. Once the elite threshold is breached, the structure can no longer enforce conservative transport, the mechanism that keeps all nodes locked in their current state of compliance. The outcome is a structural redistribution. The state stops behaving as a single coordinated accumulation object and splits into several localized structures, each seeking its own basin of stability. This process generates clear empirical signatures. We will see quiet regional withholding of taxes, the breakdown of central logistical coordination, and the hardening of local power bases at the expense of the federal core. The mathematics point toward a managed rupture, where the regime fractures along regional and neo-feudal lines, rather than a mass democratic revolution in the streets. The Russian Federation today operates in a dual reality. It is highly compressed and coercively jammed at the public level, while running a steep negative drift at the maintenance level. Analysts consistently fall into a professional misconception. They scan crowds and measure protest turnout, looking for the limits of public patience. Public patience is a rendered output, not a structural cause. A regime survives only as long as its maintenance surface stays in the positive, and its enforcer layer remains securely locked below the failure threshold. Political dominion is the structural viability of a human accumulation object, the cold math of maintaining integrity under load.